3 orange barricades changed the way I looked at people forever. Not because they blocked a road, not because they delayed my morning, but because they revealed exactly what happens when a group of people get so comfortable with power that they forget where their authority ends. The funny thing is, when I woke up that Monday morning, I wasn't thinking about conflict, lawsuits, revenge, or any of the things that would eventually follow. I was thinking about coffee. I was thinking about whether I had enough gas in my truck to make it through the week. I was thinking about ordinary life. Then I walked outside and found out my ordinary life had apparently been canceled by somebody else's committee meeting. My name is Caleb Mercer, and for nearly 15 years I've lived on a small piece of land outside a development called Silver Creek Estates. My property wasn't inside the neighborhood. It wasn't governed by their homeowners association. In fact, my family owned that land decades before the first luxury house ever appeared there. Back when my father was alive, the entire area was mostly fields, scattered trees, and dirt roads. Then developers arrived, money arrived, and eventually Silver Creek Estates appeared behind stone entrance signs and decorative fountains that looked expensive enough to have their own insurance policies. To be fair, I never had much trouble with the neighborhood. Most residents were decent people. We'd wave when we passed each other. Some of them bought eggs from a little roadside stand I kept during the summer. It wasn't some bitter feud from the beginning. The problem started after a new HOA board took over. The previous board had been practical. The new one seemed obsessed with control. Suddenly, there were notices about mailbox colors, landscaping standards, visitor parking restrictions, and all sorts of things that had absolutely nothing to do with me, but somehow always managed to spill outside their borders. At the center of it all was a woman named Denise Holloway. Denise was the HOA president, and if confidence could be bottled and sold, she would have retired rich. She carried herself like she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of managing a suburban neighborhood. Every conversation felt less like a discussion and more like an announcement. Still, I mostly stayed out of it. Their neighborhood, their rules. At least that's what I thought. That Monday morning, I stepped onto my porch holding a travel mug and immediately stopped walking. At first, I thought there had been an accident. Then I realized what I was looking at. Orange barricades stretched across the road. Temporary fencing blocked the entrance to my driveway. A bright sign hung in the center. Road closed for community improvements. I stared at it for several seconds, waiting for my brain to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes something is so ridiculous your brain refuses to process it any other way. They hadn't blocked part of the road. They had blocked my entire driveway. My only driveway. The only way in or out of my property unless I suddenly learned how to fly. I walked down and looked around expecting workers to be nearby. Nothing. No equipment. No crews. No construction activity. Just barricades. It felt like somebody had built a prison wall and then gone home for the weekend. I found a phone number on the sign and called it. After bouncing through several automated menus and waiting on hold long enough to finish half my coffee, somebody finally answered. It was Denise. The moment she picked up, I recognized the voice. Silver Creek HOA Administration. I said, "Yeah, this is Caleb Mercer. You got barricades blocking my driveway." Silence. Then, "We're resurfacing the neighborhood roads this week." I said, "That's great, but I need to leave my property." Another pause. Her voice stayed calm, almost amused. "The road is HOA property." I remember standing there looking at the fence while she said it. "Denise, my driveway connects to that road. The work should be completed within 7 business days." 7 days. She said it the same way somebody might mention a weather forecast. No concern. No apology. No attempt to solve the problem. Just 7 days. I said, "You're telling me I'm supposed to stay trapped on my property for a week?" She sighed like I was the difficult one. "Mr. Mercer, community improvements sometimes require temporary inconvenience." Then she added the sentence that stayed in my head for months afterward. "The road belongs to us, not you." Click. She hung up. I stood there staring at my phone. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to convince myself I misunderstood something. Maybe there was another access route. Maybe somebody would call back. Maybe common sense would eventually enter the room. But as the morning passed, Reality settled in. Nobody was calling back. Nobody cared. As far as the HOA was concerned, I simply didn't matter. That afternoon, I sat on the tailgate of my truck, looking toward the back of my property. Beyond a line of trees sat a neglected strip of land my father used to talk about years ago. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. To everyone else, it looked like brush, dirt, and overgrown weeds. But I remembered something Dad told me shortly before he passed away. He once pointed toward those trees and said, "You know that old service road still connects all the way through, right?" At the time, I didn't care. I was younger. It seemed like useless information. Sitting there years later, suddenly it didn't seem useless anymore. I got up, walked through the trees, and spent nearly an hour exploring. By the time I came back, an idea had started forming. It wasn't a complete plan yet. More like a spark, a possibility. The kind of possibility that makes you smile even when you know it might cause trouble. That evening, I called an old friend named Travis Boone, who owned a small excavation company. After a few minutes of catching up, I asked him a question that made him laugh. I said, "Hypothetically, how fast could you build a road through some trees?" There was a long pause. Then Travis said, "How hypothetical are we talking?" I looked toward the blocked driveway one more time and smiled. Let's just say my neighbors recently volunteered to fund a very expensive lesson in unintended consequences. Travis laughed so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Caleb, every time you start a sentence with the word hypothetically, somebody ends up spending money." I told him the whole story from the barricades to Denise hanging up on me, and by the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Finally, he said, "Well, if your property line connects where I think it does, you're not asking whether it can be done. You're asking whether it should be done." I looked out toward the trees again. "That's exactly what I'm asking." He chuckled. "Then my professional advice is absolutely not. My personal advice is call me at 6 tomorrow morning." I barely slept that night. Part of me kept wondering if I was overreacting. Maybe I should hire a lawyer. Maybe I should call the county. Maybe I should try one more conversation with the HOA. But every time I replayed Denise's voice saying, "The road belongs to us, not you," the same feeling came back. It wasn't about inconvenience anymore. It was about being dismissed, about being treated like I didn't have rights simply because I wasn't inside their gates. The next morning, before sunrise, I heard the sound of diesel engines rolling up my driveway. Well, as close to my driveway as anybody could get. Travis arrived with a bulldozer, a skid steer, 2 dump trucks, and 3 workers who looked entirely too excited to spend a day clearing trees. One of them stepped out, looked at the barricades blocking my driveway, and asked, "Those the people paying for today's entertainment?" I smiled. Indirectly. By 7 o'clock, the machines were moving. Trees that had stood untouched for years started coming down. Brush disappeared. Dirt was pushed aside. The sound echoed through the property like thunder. Every once in a while, I'd catch myself grinning. Not because I was trying to get revenge, but because for the first time since this started, I wasn't stuck. I was doing something. Around mid-morning, I noticed a black SUV parked near the barricades. A woman wearing oversized sunglasses stood watching the equipment. Even from a distance, I recognized Denise. She stayed there for about 10 minutes before leaving. An hour later, my phone rang. I already knew who it was. Mr. Mercer. Her voice sounded tighter than before. "What's going on back there?" I looked at the bulldozer carving through another section of dirt. "Community improvements." There was silence. Then, "Excuse me." I leaned against the truck. "Temporary inconvenience. Remember?" Another pause. "Are you building a road?" "Looks that way." "Where does it go?" "My property." "Where does it connect?" "You'll find out." She wasn't used to conversations ending without her controlling them. I could practically hear her trying to decide whether to threaten me or negotiate. Instead, she said, "We'll be monitoring the situation." I smiled. "Have fun." Then I hung up. By late afternoon, the impossible had become reality. A rough but functional gravel road stretched from the back of my property through the cleared land and connected directly to an old county service road that most people had forgotten existed. Travis stood beside me, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Well," he said, "you officially have another way out." I drove my truck down the new road for the first time just before sunset. The gravel crunched beneath the tires. Dust floated behind me. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. For the first time in 2 days, I could leave my property whenever I wanted. Problem solved. At least that's what I thought. The funny thing about solving one problem is sometimes you accidentally create a much bigger one. The first week after the road opened, nothing unusual happened. A few service vehicles noticed it. A delivery driver used it once or twice. Then more people started discovering it. A landscaping crew used it. A utility truck used it. Then somebody uploaded an updated route into a navigation system. Then another. Then another. By the end of the second week, I started noticing something strange. Cars were appearing regularly behind Silver Creek Estates. Not dozens at first, just enough to make me curious. One afternoon, I sat on my porch counting them. 27 vehicles passed within an hour. The next day, there were more. A week later, there were far more. Eventually, I figured out what was happening. My new road had unintentionally created a shortcut between two major roads on opposite sides of town. Drivers heading toward the commercial district could shave several minutes off their commute by avoiding the subdivision entrance and a notoriously crowded intersection nearby. It wasn't just locals either. Delivery services started routing vehicles through the area. Contractors used it. Utility companies used it. Garbage trucks used it. Once GPS systems learned the route existed, it spread faster than gossip at a family reunion. What had started as a private access road suddenly became part of everyday traffic patterns. And that was when the complaints began. Not from me, from inside the subdivision. One evening, I was eating dinner when my neighbor from across the county road called. He was laughing too hard to get the words out. Finally, he managed to say, "You should see the Silver Creek community page." Apparently, residents were furious. Posts complained about increased traffic. Complaints poured in about noise. People were blaming the HOA. Others were blaming county planners. Some were blaming developers. Nobody seemed entirely sure what happened, but everybody agreed they hated it. A few days later, I stopped at a gas station and ran into a man who lived inside Silver Creek. We'd always gotten along. He shook his head and laughed. "You know they're holding emergency meetings now, right?" "About what?" I asked. "About your road." Hearing those two words together felt surreal. My road, like it had become some kind of local legend. He leaned closer. "Half the neighborhood thinks you built it on purpose." I smiled. "I built it because I needed to get to work." "Yeah, but now everyone thinks you're playing chess while they're playing checkers." The truth was much less dramatic. I genuinely hadn't expected any of this. I wanted access to my property. That was it. The traffic was simply a consequence nobody predicted. Well, almost nobody. About 3 weeks later, I was sitting on my porch when two vehicles pulled into the driveway. Not the blocked driveway, the new road. That detail alone made me laugh. Out stepped Denise and another board member named Harold Benson. Harold looked uncomfortable before he even reached the porch. Denise looked like somebody forcing herself to smile through a dental procedure. I invited them to sit down. Neither accepted. Denise cleared her throat. "Mr. Mercer, Caleb's fine. We'd like to discuss the road." "Which one?" Her jaw tightened. "The gravel road." "Ah." I nodded. "My road." Harold shifted his weight. Denise continued. "Traffic volume has increased significantly. Even noticed. Residents have concerns." "I'm sure they do." She took a slow breath. "We're hoping you might consider limiting access." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. This was the same person who had told me the HOA road belonged exclusively to them. The same person who left me stranded. Now she was standing on my property, asking for a favor. I leaned back in my chair and looked at both of them. "Let me make sure I understand. A month ago, I was told roads belong to whoever owns them." Neither replied. "And now you're asking me to close one that belongs to me?" Harold looked down at the ground. Denise forced a smile. "The situations are different." I couldn't help laughing. Not mean laugh, just genuine disbelief. They seem pretty similar from where I'm sitting. For the first time since this all started, Denise had no quick response. No prepared speech. No authority to hide behind. Just silence. The kind of silence that appears when somebody suddenly realizes they're arguing against their own words. Eventually, she said, "We're simply trying to preserve the character of our community." I looked toward the subdivision in the distance. then back toward the steady stream of vehicles occasionally passing behind it. Funny thing about community, I said quietly. It usually works better when people remember they're part of a larger one. Neither of them said anything after that, and as they turned to leave, I had a feeling the story wasn't over yet, because the look on Denise's face wasn't anger anymore. It was something much more dangerous. It was the look of someone realizing they'd lost control of the outcome. For the next few weeks, something interesting happened. Nobody from the HOA contacted me. No letters showed up. No lawyers appeared. No threats arrived. On the surface, it looked like the situation had settled down, but I've lived long enough to know that silence can sometimes be louder than an argument, especially when people are used to getting their way. Meanwhile, the traffic continued growing. Not dramatically, not enough to turn the area into a highway, but enough that everyone noticed. Delivery vans rolled through regularly. Contractors used a shortcut almost every day. Commuters learned the route and stuck with it. Every now and then I'd sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch vehicles pass in the distance, still amazed that a road built out of frustration had somehow become part of the local landscape. Then one afternoon, I received a certified letter. The return address belonged to Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I opened it expecting another fight. Instead, I found something completely different. The letter informed me that road resurfacing near my original driveway had been completed. It also stated that future maintenance projects would include accommodations ensuring uninterrupted access to my property. I read that sentence 3 times just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Uninterrupted access. Those words would have been useful a month earlier. Attached to the letter was a formal statement acknowledging that my property required permanent access regardless of HOA construction activities. No apology, of course. Organizations rarely apologize when paperwork can accomplish the same thing. Still, I knew what it meant. Somebody had finally consulted attorneys. Somebody had finally reviewed property records. Somebody had finally realized that treating neighboring landowners like obstacles was far more expensive than treating them like neighbors. A week later, county crews appeared and finished paving the section of roadway near my driveway more thoroughly than it had ever been paved before. The work was clean, professional, permanent. Watching them work felt oddly satisfying. Not because I enjoyed winning, at least not entirely. It was satisfying because common sense had finally arrived, even if it showed up fashionably late. A few days after that, I ran into Harold at a hardware store. He looked exhausted. We exchanged small talk for a minute before he shook his head and laughed. You know, none of this would have happened if somebody had just let you out of your driveway. I laughed too. I've been saying that from the beginning. He looked around to make sure nobody was listening. Then he lowered his voice. You want the truth? Always. He sighed. The board thought you'd complain for a few days, then wait. Nobody expected you to actually solve the problem yourself. There it was. The entire story distilled into one sentence. Nobody expected me to solve the problem myself, because that's what had really bothered them. Not the road, not the traffic, not the meetings. The assumption had been that authority automatically created compliance. That if they said wait, I would wait. If they said accept it, I would accept it. If they ignored my concerns, eventually I would stop raising them. Instead, I found another option. Harold chuckled and started walking away before turning back one last time. For what it's worth, Denise resigned from the board last week. I blinked. Seriously? He nodded. Turns out angry residents don't enjoy hearing about unintended consequences every month. Then he walked away smiling. I stood there for a moment absorbing that information. I didn't feel victorious. Honestly, I felt relieved. The whole situation had never been about defeating someone. It had been about refusing to be cornered. There's a difference. A lot of people confuse the two. Months passed. Seasons changed. Life slowly returned to normal. My original driveway remained fully accessible. The gravel road behind my property remained open. The subdivision continued existing. The world kept spinning. Yet every now and then I'd notice something that made me smile. A delivery truck using the shortcut, a line of commuters passing through, a GPS voice somewhere directing another driver along a route that technically existed because an HOA once decided to block the wrong driveway. One evening near sunset, I stood near the back road, watching headlights move through the distance. The golden light reflected off windshields as cars disappeared toward town. It was quiet except for the occasional sound of tires on gravel. I remember thinking about my father. He would have loved the irony. Years earlier, he had casually mentioned that forgotten service road. Neither of us could have imagined how important that random piece of information would become one day. Funny how life works like that. Sometimes the details people ignore end up changing everything. Looking back now, I don't think the lesson was about roads at all. It wasn't even about HOAs. The real lesson was about respect. When people have power, whether it's a title, a committee position, or control over a piece of pavement, they eventually face a choice. They can use that power to solve problems, or they can use it to remind everyone else that they have it. One choice builds communities. The other creates consequences. Silver Creek learned that lesson the hard way. And every time somebody asks me whether I'd do it all again, I usually give the same answer. I wouldn't have built the road if they hadn't blocked the driveway. The road wasn't the cause. It was the result. That's an important distinction. Cause and effect have a funny way of finding each other. Even years later, these days I mostly use my original driveway. It's easier, cleaner, and closer to the house. But the gravel road is still there. The county still recognizes it. Drivers still use it. And every once in a while, when traffic drifts past the backside of those expensive homes, I can't help remembering the phone call that started everything. The road belongs to us, not you. I wonder sometimes if Denise remembers saying that. I wonder if anyone on that board drives past the shortcut and thinks about how differently things could have gone if they'd simply shown a little respect on day one. Then again, maybe they tell the story differently. Maybe in their version, I'm the stubborn neighbor who caused unnecessary trouble. Maybe they think I went too far. Honestly, that's possible. And that's exactly why I want to ask you something. If you had been standing in my shoes that morning, staring at barricades blocking the only way out of your property, what would you have done? Would you have waited the week? Called a lawyer? Fought the HOA in court? Or would you have built the road? Let me know in the comments, because after all these years, people still argue about who was right, who was wrong, and whether what happened was justice or simply consequences. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who has dealt with difficult neighbors, HOA drama, or a situation where a little power went straight to someone's head. And remember, sometimes the most expensive mistakes don't start with bad intentions. They start with somebody assuming you have no other way out.